Please pray with me. O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Maybe you feel it lately. I don't know for sure, but as you encounter things on the news, things in your life, you can feel very acutely as if we're living in uncertain times. What can you really bank on? The state of the world seems pretty upset, pretty insecure. Acts of terror seem to be on the rise, even stateside, even in our own country and communities. There's racial tensions and violence and things like that going on. There's cyclical political instability, and I don't know that necessarily there's a huge amount of confidence that's welled up in me as a result of the recent conventions from either party and everything in our country. We can also feel we're in uncertain times because of how things come at us in our personal lives. Maybe a sudden accident or a diagnosis that just changes everything and kind of sets you on a sort of roller coaster ride. But let's be clear about this. The people living in biblical times dealt with uncertainty as well. And so this is nothing new to us, okay? The first century in the Roman Empire wasn't necessarily living the dream, okay? In AD 60 and to 62, the estimated time when Paul's letter to the Colossians was written, this was during the reign of Emperor Nero, okay? You know anything about Nero? Kind of a colorful character. He brought a lot of culture to the empire through arts and athletics, and yet he also was known for being very tyrannical and executing lots of people. He, in fact, is known for killing off his own mother, Agrippina. And so what kind of a heart does a person have to bring themselves to do something like that? He's rumored to do all sorts of other things, like when Rome was burning in fire, he sat on his balcony and watched it happen and just played music. Cool and unfeeling about the whole thing. He's rumored to have basically burned Christians at the stake like tiki torches on his lawn. So much did he loathe this movement. Okay? Uncertain times, right? Messy, nasty things. So the question is, who do we follow when the ground beneath us seems uncertain, when everything around us seems like kind of shaken up, like people aren't getting it, and these kinds of things, when everything seems to be falling apart? The answer is the same today as it was back then. Trust in Jesus, the Lord of all, who's holding it all together. Yeah. Trust in Jesus, Lord of all. He's holding it all together. I had one of these kinds of experiences where I was dealing with a lot of internal struggle over the course of this past week. And, it was a lot to work through. And I sought out some extra help along the way. And I'm fortunate to work in a staff that kind of brings me back to my senses as well. And so I'm thankful in particular of how all the different talents and the abilities of the people around me come together to support things and to make them happen. Today in particular, Pastor John and I, we collaborate on messages because we do the same at Prince Peace and Crosspoint, and he really did a lot of heavy lifting in this message, and so he helped be Christ to me and holding some facet of that together, okay? Right? So, So if you're wondering why the message is short or especially good today, you can thank Pastor John. There you go. All right? So there we go. So Paul, in this letter, he starts out and he says, hey, I'm Paul, an apostle, a sent one. And Paul here, he's likely writing from prison in Ephesus. And he names himself alongside Timothy, right? Timothy is Paul's protege. He's his co-worker in the gospel. And he says, this is to God's holy people in Colossae. Okay? Now, Colossae is in modern-day Turkey. It's about 100 miles inland from Ephesus. Okay, just located geographically. Likely, the letter that Paul wrote to Philemon was released and was in transit about the same time. This letter regarding Onesimus, so likely en route at the same time. Onesimus actually named in chapter 4, verse 9 of this letter. Okay? Again, the cast of characters. There's Epaphras. So he's the founding pastor of this congregation. And the way that Paul writes it, it's like, I've not met you guys personally, but Epaphras really has been cultivating what's been going on there. And so Paul, in this letter, he's writing and he's praying to this fledgling congregation. And what does he want them to hold on to? Jesus. Because Jesus holds everything together. Now, verses 15 to 20. That's kind of the peak of the whole chapter. Verses 15 to 20 are like a poem or a hymn about the supremacy of Christ. So let's spend a little time chewing on specifically those verses, right? Verses 15 to 20. Now, biblical scholar N.T. Wright, he says, he cites that this poem, Paul, what he's doing here is exploring and exploiting different facets of meaning of the Hebrew word for head, rosh, okay? And so we see him kind of dancing around these in verses 15 to 20. So, first he says, Jesus is the firstborn. Well, what does that mean? By the way, if you've read this letter, you know that Paul is using kind of complex language. This is not as easily accessible. Mary, we talked about that as we got into the sanctuary this morning. Long sentences, big words, kind of a lot of abstractions. So he says, Paul says, Jesus is the firstborn over all creation. In other words, he was there with God at the beginning, so you can kind of get your mind around who he's on equal status with. Okay? And then it says, he's the firstborn from among the dead in verse 18. And so here again, if God raised Jesus from the dead, then there's something special going on that is beyond sort of normal human stuff. Okay? So then he says Jesus is supreme, the number one, ahead of everything else. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The number one. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Then it says Jesus is head of the body, the church. And then also in verse 18, Jesus is the beginning. He's the start of it all. Now, there's some other aspects of Jesus' identity that shine through in this poem, and it kind of goes like this. Number one, if you want to know who God is or things about him and his character, then look no further than Jesus, because he is the mirror image. Number two, he is the connecting link between original creation that was perfect and beautiful and in the presence of God and now fallen. He's the connecting link between that and new creation that God is going to one day fully and finally bring about. The new heavens and new earth. He's the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega. And number three, since we're free in the gospel, free through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, and we have peace with God, and we don't have to prove anything anymore, we can look to Jesus for cues on how to live, on how to be fully human and embody God's purposes for our lives. Yeah. So maybe you notice if you're looking at verses 15 to 20, there's kind of this parallelism that goes on. There are these balancing sections there, okay? And it goes like this. He's the image of God, the firstborn, for in him. You see that refrain? And then also at the other end of it, he's the start of it all, the firstborn, for in him. And so these frames, they kind of wrap up the central section, the red hot center, the chewy nougat that you really need to really work your way through in the middle, the best part of it all. So they frame that in and they say, whoosh, here's where your attention really needs to be, the focus of it all. See, above all, to grow as Christians, to increase in wisdom and power and patience and thanksgiving, remember this one central truth. Jesus holds everything together. Sound familiar? So Paul's worked this truth throughout the entire chapter. Every single portion, if we break it down into a couple of verses at a time. Verses 1 and 2, he gives this common introduction that you see in his letters. It's a pattern. And he brings greetings through the grace of Christ. And he reminds us here that we're part of the same family, though Paul and the Colossians had never met personally. And so it's an amazing kind of thing. Maybe you've had an experience like this. I think that some of our youth right now who are at the tail end of their South Carolina mission trip are experiencing that in amazing kind of ways, where you meet somebody that you didn't know from Adam and you discover that there's this beautiful unity because you are brothers and sisters in Christ. And so it doesn't matter that you live states away or countries away from each other, but all of a sudden worlds come together. And all the differences of geography and language and skin color and everything else, it all melts away and Jesus holds it together. Maybe you've experienced this on a real personal basis as you think about and as you've dared to get connected in a smaller group of believers. I feel this way in terms of being part of the family of God. And this acute sense of church as family, well, I feel it when I'm in worship with all of you. But I feel it in a very significant way as I come into a living room space. Maybe it's my own, or maybe it's somebody else from this congregation that I've met, where our peace group gathers. And all of a sudden, it's me and other young parents or other people from this community coming into intimate space and sharing a meal like family and helping to parent each other's kids and lifting one another up through the struggles of life and praying that we can live beyond ourselves, that we can go beyond that and share Jesus with other people that we meet. Powerful, powerful things. This concept of the family of God. So, who holds us together in the new family? Jesus does. All right, hey, you're just chiming right in. This is great. This is good. This shows me that, I don't need to tell you, you're getting it, okay? All right, verses 3 through 7, Paul gives thanks for them. Now note, he didn't do that with the Galatians, right? They were foolish. They had forgotten the core things of the gospel. But these Colossians, he gives thanks for them because they have faith and love that springs from the foundational hope of Christ crucified and raised again to new life. So who holds together faith and love? Jesus does. Hope that we have in new life in Jesus, that holds it together. Verses 9 through 13. In this section, Paul really develops this concept of how we were in a tough spot. We were falling apart. We were in darkness. We were in the kingdom of darkness. And God took us. He plucked us. He rescued us from that kingdom of darkness and brought us into the safety and security of the kingdom of His Son. Right? So amazing, amazing stuff. So who holds us safely in this new kingdom? Jesus does. All right, if we skip beyond that central, the chewy nougat center, verses 15 to 20, and then we go to 21 to 23, we see it there too. We were once far off from God because of our stubborn sinfulness, our selfishness. But then he brought us back to himself through the physical death of Jesus. Jesus paid our price in full, and there's no interest owed, no strings attached, no extra fees, no fine print, no nothing. And we find ourselves free. So who holds you safe from the accusation that you aren't good enough, beautiful enough, happy enough, religious enough for God to love you? Jesus does. And finally, verses 24 to 27, we see it there as well. The kingdom of God can be experienced by every person on the face of the planet. But how? Through you. Through Christ in you. Close, but no cigar, right? Okay? Yeah. So the hope of glory is seen through Christ in you. No longer physically present. He left his Spirit in you, right? Galatians 2:20. I've been crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. Who holds you in such high esteem that he makes your life the answer to the ultimate divine mystery? Jesus does. Jesus is Lord of all. Jesus holds us together as his family, creating us anew as brothers and sisters in his grace. Jesus holds us safely in his kingdom, reassuring us that when we fall, his love for us does not fail. Jesus holds us up to the world, calling us to show the world who Jesus is. Jesus holds everything, and I mean everything, together. He's Lord of all. This means that Christianity is all about Jesus, which means that our lives have to get to be all about Jesus, not about our egos, not about our net worth, not about our happiness or our comfort, none of that. You and me, we're all about Jesus. So let's get busy letting the world know it's all about Jesus. People's lives will be changed for all of eternity when they're able to see Jesus through you. Your family, your friends, your neighbors, and coworkers, they're all waiting. They're all dying to see Jesus in you. And when they do, all of the uncertainty that has plagued them their whole lives, it will melt away. It'll be gone. And they'll be free because Jesus holds everything together. And all God's people said, amen.